January 1946. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The transport trucks rolled through the gates at dawn, their canvas covers snapping in the cold wind that swept down from the Appalachian foothills. Inside, 43 women sat in silence, their hands folded in their laps, their faces marked by the dust of a 3-day journey across the Atlantic and then southward through a land they had been taught to fear. They were German women, nurses, signals operators, administrative personnel captured in the final chaotic weeks of the Third Reich's collapse. They wore the remnants of Wehrmacht auxiliary uniforms, gray wool that had grown thin at the elbows, boots held together with wire and determination. Through the gaps in the canvas, they caught glimpses of a country that seemed impossible, paved roads stretching endlessly, telephone poles marching in perfect formation, houses with painted shutters and green lawns that defied the winter season. When the trucks stopped before a low wooden building marked "Processing," the women descended slowly, uncertainly, like prisoners approaching a scaffold. They had crossed an ocean, expecting retribution. What they found instead was a young American sergeant holding a clipboard, her uniform crisp and fitted, her manner businesslike, but not unkind. "This way," she said in careful, textbook German. "You'll be processed, documented, and assigned quarters. First, you'll shower and receive clean clothing." The word shower passed through the group like an electric current. In the camps they had heard about, in the whispered rumors that circulated through the holding facilities in France, showers meant something else entirely. They had seen the photographs, heard the testimonies, knew what the Reich had done in the East. Now they stood on the other side of that history, prisoners themselves, and the architecture of fear they had ignored or enabled had become the lens through which they interpreted their own fate. To understand the terror that gripped these women as they walked toward the bathhouse that January morning, one must travel backward through the rubble of a collapsed ideology, through the 12 years of the 1,000-year Reich, through the propaganda that had shaped every aspect of German civilian life since 1933. These women had come of age under National Socialism. They had attended schools where biology textbooks taught racial hierarchy as scientific fact. They had joined the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, where they learned that their highest purpose was service to the Volk and the state. They had worked in field hospitals where wounded soldiers told them that Germany fought for its very survival against Jewish Bolshevism and Western plutocracy. They had believed, or had chosen to believe, that their cause was just their sacrifices necessary, their nation's violence defensive. By 1945, as the Reich crumbled, those certainties had dissolved into chaos and terror. The women who now stood before an American bathhouse had witnessed the final months of the war, the endless columns of refugees fleeing westward, the cities reduced to burning skeletons, the summary executions of deserters, the SS units that shot civilians for displaying white flags. Many had been in Berlin or Dresden or Hamburg when the bombs fell. They had pulled bodies from cellars, had seen children crushed beneath collapsed buildings, had learned that total war meant exactly what it promised. And in those final weeks, as Soviet forces advanced from the east and Allied armies from the west, they had heard the stories of what Russian soldiers did to German women, stories of summary executions, stories of revenge without mercy. Surrendering to the Americans had seemed the lesser evil, but it was still surrender to an enemy they had been taught to fear. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry had spent years depicting Americans as mongrelized, decadent, controlled by Jewish financiers and Negro jazz musicians, a nation without culture or soul. Yet that same propaganda had also conveyed, inadvertently, America's terrifying industrial capacity. German soldiers returning from North Africa or Normandy spoke in awed tones of American abundance, the endless columns of vehicles, the artillery shells that fell like rain, the chocolate bars and cigarettes that American soldiers distributed casually, as if such luxuries were infinite. The Reich had mobilized every resource, scraped every coal mine, rationed every gram of butter, and still been overwhelmed by an enemy that seemed to wage war almost carelessly, with supplies to spare. Now these women were about to discover what that abundance meant for prisoners of war. The bathhouse was a simple wooden structure, painted white, with concrete floors and high windows that let in cold winter light. Inside, a row of shower heads protruded from the walls, simple utilitarian, clearly designed for function rather than deception. But the women entering that room had been conditioned by 3 years of whispered horror, by the knowledge of what the Reich had done, by the logical assumption that victors behave as their own forces had behaved in the East. Oberschwester Helena Richter, a 32-year-old surgical nurse who had served in field hospitals from Stalingrad to the Rhine, would later write in her memoir, We undressed in complete silence. No one spoke. No one looked at each other. We each believed we were living our final moments, and there is a strange dignity in that, a refusal to panic, to give them the satisfaction of our fear. I remember thinking of my mother, wondering if she would ever learn what happened to me. I remember the cold concrete beneath my feet. I remember the smell of pine disinfectant and the sound of water running somewhere deeper in the building. And I remember thinking, this is how it ends. Not with glory or meaning, but naked and afraid in a tiled room in a country whose name I had spoken with contempt for 12 years. An American corporal, a young black woman from Alabama named Sarah Mitchell, stood at the entrance with a clipboard, checking names against a roster. She had been assigned to prisoner processing because she spoke some German learned from Mennonite neighbors in her hometown. Years later, in an oral history recorded by the Veterans History Project, she would remember that morning. They looked at me like I was going to shoot them. I'd never seen people that scared. At first I thought maybe it was because I was Negro, their propaganda had said all kinds of things about us. But then I realized they were looking past me at the showers. One of the older women, she had this wild look in her eyes, and she said to me in English, "Make it quick. Please make it quick." I didn't understand at first. Then it hit me what they thought. And I felt sick. I went to the sergeant and I said, "Ma'am, they think we're going to gas them." The sergeant, she just closed her eyes for a moment, then she walked into that room, and she turned on every single shower herself. Hot water. Steam rising. She held her hand under the water, and she said in German, "It's just water. It's just a shower. You're prisoners of war. You're protected under the Geneva Convention. We're not like you were." The water ran clear and hot, heated by coal boilers that burned with American abundance. And beside each shower station on a small wooden shelf sat a bar of soap. Not the ersatz soap of the Reich's final years, that gray-green substance made from clay and industrial waste that crumbled in your hands and left you feeling dirtier than before. Not the tiny slivers that German housewives hoarded and rationed, cutting them into smaller pieces, making them last months. These were full bars of white soap, stamped with the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps insignia, each weighing 4 ounces, smelling of clean alkaline purity, and some faint botanical essence, lavender, perhaps, or pine. Soap made with fat rendered from American cattle, live from American factories, packaged by American workers who had never missed a meal, never huddled in a cellar while bombs fell, never stood in a ration line for 6 hours to receive a half-pound of black bread. Richter wrote, "When I understood that the water was truly just water, when I felt the heat of it on my skin, I began to weep. I could not stop. I stood under that shower and I washed myself with that soap, that extravagant, impossible soap, and I cried for everything I had lost, for everything I had believed, for the country that had lied to us so completely that we expected to be murdered in a shower, because we knew, deep in our souls, that we had done exactly that to others. The soap lathered. It cleaned. It was gentle on skin that had not been truly clean in months. And that gentleness was more devastating than any cruelty could have been. The soap became a symbol, though none of them could have articulated it in that moment. It represented something they had not encountered in years: surplus. Abundance without purpose beyond human comfort. The Reich had mobilized soap, indeed mobilized everything, for the war effort. Fats went to explosives, glycerin to munitions. What remained for civilian use was rationed, distributed, accounted for in ledgers kept by local Nazi Party officials. Every bar of soap in Germany in 1944 represented a calculation. This much fat could have been used for this purpose, but we choose to use it for that purpose instead. Nothing existed simply to make life easier or more pleasant. Everything served the state, the war, the ultimate victory that always hung just beyond reach. American soap served no higher purpose than cleanliness and comfort. It was produced by factories that also made soap for civilian use, without rationing, without sacrifice. The women washing themselves in Fort Oglethorpe were experiencing a resource economy that could wage total war without requiring total mobilization of its civilian population. They were touching, quite literally, the industrial and agricultural capacity that had buried the Wehrmacht under an avalanche of steel and explosives. One of the prisoners, Gertrude Meinhardt, a signals operator from Hamburg who was 23 years old and weighed 94 pounds, picked up her bar of soap after her shower and held it to her nose, breathing in its clean scent. She turned it over in her hands, examining the stamped letters, U.S. Army QMC. She had operated communications equipment in bunkers as British Lancaster bombers turned her city into an inferno. She had dug herself out of collapsed buildings twice. She had watched her teenage brother board a train to the Eastern Front and had never seen him again. She had believed in final victory until the moment American tanks rolled into her suburb and a young lieutenant, no older than her brother had been, offered her a cigarette and told her in broken German that the war was over. Now she stood in a clean room, in a country that had been at war for 3.5 years, but whose cities still had electricity, whose farms still produced surplus, whose factories made soap for prisoners. She slipped the bar of soap into the pocket of the clean gray cotton dress the Americans had given her, not to use, but to keep, to prove to herself that this moment was real. The historical record of German POWs in the United States is extensive and, in many ways, remarkable. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held approximately 425,000 German prisoners of war in camps across the country, far from combat zones, far from bombed-out cities, in a landscape of abundance that seemed almost obscene to men and women who had lived through years of rationing and deprivation. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear rules for the treatment of POWs: adequate food, medical care, protection from violence, work for pay, access to correspondence, and recreation. The United States, broadly speaking, followed these rules. Not out of altruism, particularly, but out of practical self-interest, American POWs held by Germany were more likely to be treated well if German POWs in America were treated well. Reciprocity, backed by international law and neutral observers from the International Red Cross. But the German POW experience in America became something more than mere compliance with international law. It became a confrontation with a system they had been taught was corrupt, weak, and doomed. The cognitive dissonance was profound and, for many, transformative. The camps themselves varied widely in character and condition. Some were converted civilian conservation corps camps from the New Deal era, clusters of wooden barracks set in forests or farmland. Others were purpose-built, constructed quickly by Army engineers in the geometric patterns that characterized American military efficiency. Fort Oglethorpe, where the women arrived that January morning, had been a cavalry post in the 19th century, then an army training center during the First World War. By 1946, it housed several hundred German POWs, mostly women from auxiliary units, plus some civilian internees who had been caught up in the chaotic final sweeps through occupied Germany. The daily routine was structured but not harsh. Reveille at 6, breakfast at 7, work assignments at 8. The women worked in camp kitchens, in laundries, in administrative offices, in the camp garden that would be planted when spring arrived. They were paid 80 cents per day in canteen scrip, which could be used to purchase cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper, and other small luxuries. They received 3 meals daily, not lavish, but adequate and sometimes surprisingly varied. They slept in barracks with coal stoves, 2 blankets per bunk, and windows that could be opened in warm weather. They attended classes in English and mathematics taught by other prisoners who had been teachers. They received mail from Germany when mail could get through the chaos of occupation. They were allowed to practice their religion, to form choirs and theatrical groups, to publish camp newspapers. What they were not allowed to do was escape the evidence of American abundance. It surrounded them, pressed in on them, undermined everything they had believed about the superiority of the German system and the decadence of Western democracy. She carried with her, wrapped in paper at the bottom of her small suitcase, 3 bars of American soap that she had saved from her final months at Fort Oglethorpe. She would keep them for the rest of her life, never using them, never discarding them. In her memoir, published in 1963, she wrote, "Those bars of soap represent a truth I spent 12 years refusing to see. The truth that prosperity does not require conquest, that strength does not require cruelty, that a nation can be powerful and humane simultaneously. The Reich promised us greatness and delivered ash. America promised us nothing. We were their prisoners after all, and yet demonstrated a casual abundance and institutional fairness that exposed every lie we had been told. I keep those bars of soap not as souvenirs, but as evidence. Evidence that I was wrong. Evidence that we were all wrong. Evidence that there is a better way to organize human society, imperfect perhaps, but better than what we chose." Meinhardt returned to Hamburg in the autumn of 1946. The city was unrecognizable, whole districts simply gone, replaced by fields of rubble where grass was beginning to grow. She found her mother alive, living in 3 rooms of a partially collapsed apartment building. Her brother's name appeared on a casualty list. killed in action near Kursk in July 1943, 3 years earlier, though the family had held out hope. Meinhardt worked odd jobs, learned secretarial skills, eventually found employment with the British Occupation Administration. In 1949, she married a British liaison officer and moved to London. In a letter to her mother written in 1950, she reflected, "Sometimes I think of those months in Georgia as a strange dream. We were prisoners, but we were fed and safe and treated according to law. We were enemies, but we were given soap and blankets and small wages for our work. Germany made war to secure living space and resources, and it destroyed itself. America, which had no need to make war for resources, treated even its prisoners with a material generosity we could not imagine. I do not idealize the Americans. Sarah told me stories of her childhood in Alabama that were horrifying, but I learned from them that democracy, for all its contradictions, allows for correction in ways that dictatorship does not. The soap was not a kindness. It was simply abundance meeting policy. But it taught me more about systems and ideology than 12 years of education under the Reich. Not all stories ended in transformation or reconciliation. Some women returned to Germany still bitter, still resentful, blaming their captivity and Germany's defeat on conspiracy or betrayal rather than on the regime they had served. Human beings are capable of profound rationalization, and ideology dies hard when it has shaped one's entire understanding of the world. But the historical record suggests that a significant number of German POWs held in the United States underwent some degree of ideological shift, not through propaganda or re-education programs. The Americans did not systematically attempt this, but through the simple experience of living for months or years in a system that operated on different principles than the one they had known. The soap was a small thing. 4 ounces of alkaline compounds and fats, stamped with a quartermaster insignia, distributed weekly without ceremony or significance. But small things, repeated and reliable, accumulate meaning. The soap represented a resource economy capable of waging total war while maintaining civilian abundance. It represented an industrial capacity that could supply its military, its population, and even its prisoners without exhaustion. It represented a system that, whatever its moral failures in other domains, could extend basic dignities even to enemies because those dignities were written into law and procedure rather than dependent on the whims of individual leaders. For women who had been taught that strength required suffering, that greatness required sacrifice, that power required the subjugation of others, the soap was a quiet refutation. It said, abundance can be shared. Resources can be sufficient. Power can coexist with procedural fairness. These were not dramatic revelations. They were simply facts experienced daily until the cumulative weight of those facts became undeniable. In the winter of 1946, a German woman stood in an American shower, naked and terrified, expecting death. Instead, she received hot water and soap. This was not mercy particularly, it was policy, procedure, compliance with international law. But from her perspective, from the perspective of someone who had lived through the collapse of a regime that promised everything and delivered catastrophe, that soap was a revelation. She washed herself. The soap lathered. It cleaned. It smelled of something botanical and clean. It did not crumble or dissolve immediately. It was abundant, sufficient, ordinary. And in that ordinariness was a truth more powerful than any propaganda, that a just system, however imperfect, provides for human dignity not as a gift but as a baseline assumption. That abundance need not be hoarded or conquered. That strength and cruelty are not synonyms. That the architecture of democracy, with all its inefficiencies and contradictions, can produce outcomes that authoritarianism, for all its proclaimed efficiency, cannot. The soap was never just soap. It was evidence. It was a symbol. It was a small, ordinary object that contained multitudes. The women who held those bars of soap in January 1946 could not have articulated all of this. They were exhausted, frightened, confronting the collapse of everything they had believed. But in the months and years that followed, as they washed their hands and their clothes and their bodies with soap that appeared each week, without fail, as they lived under a system that treated them according to written rules rather than arbitrary power, something shifted. Not for all of them, but for enough. They learned that the enemy they had been taught to despise possessed a different kind of strength, not the strength of conquest, but the strength of surplus, not the power of violence, but the power of systems that constrain violence, not the greatness of subjugation, but the ordinary greatness of having enough and sharing the excess. Years later, those who survived would tell their children and grandchildren about the war, about the defeat, about the camps where they were held as prisoners. And some of them would mention the soap, that impossible, abundant soap that taught them more about power and ideology than all the propaganda, and all the speeches, and all the promises of the thousand-year Reich that lasted 12 years and ended in ash. The soap was ordinary. The soap was extraordinary. The soap was evidence that they had been lied to about nearly everything. And so they washed themselves and were made clean, and began the long, painful work of understanding what they had been, what they had believed, and what else might be possible in a world ordered by different principles. In the end, the soap was simply soap. But sometimes the simplest things carry the heaviest truths, and sometimes a bar of ordinary soap, appearing weekly without fail, can unravel an ideology built on cruelty and lies. That is not the soap's doing. It is simply evidence of what exists when a society organizes itself, however imperfectly, around principles of abundance, law, and the persistent belief that even enemies retain some irreducible human dignity that cannot be washed away.